Hello, and welcome everyone to this Authors Guild Foundation webinar in our new series, Business Boot Camps for Writers, brought to you with support from the National Endowment for the Arts, Penguin Random House, and our generous donors. Today's panel is here for part 2 of Paths to Publication, and we'll be discussing alternatives to traditional publishing. Last night we had a panel on paths to traditional publication, and a recording of that talk will be available soon. You can register for more Business Boot Camps events at authorsguild.org/bootcamps, and we'll be announcing more events very soon, so please stay tuned. And now I'll turn it over to Jane Friedman, our expert moderator. Jane has nearly 25 years of experience in the publishing industry. She writes and publishes the Hot Sheet, an industry newsletter for authors, and that was named 2020 Media Outlet of the Year by Digital Book World. We're so happy to have Jane Friedman here today and our excellent panelists. Jane and everyone, welcome, and to our audience, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Johnny. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks again to the panelists for taking time for this session. So let me just briefly introduce who's here with us today. We have Tara Kremen, who is director at Kobo Writing Life, an ebook and audiobook distributor. We have Darian G., an award-winning author of 5 novels, who has published with various types of publishers and also runs a hybrid publishing program. We have Mark Leslie Lefebvre, author of more than 20 books, who has also worked at Kobo and is now with the distributor Draft to Digital. Leslie Penelope is an award-winning author of fantasy and paranormal romance. And last but not least, Brooke Warner is the publisher of She Writes Press and Spark Press, which are hybrid publishers, and prior to that, she was in traditional publishing. All right, so I'm gonna dive right in first with, well, actually, before I dive in, for the attendees, let me give you a sense of how we'll move through the conversation today. We're gonna start with some definitions, which I think are important in this space. We'll talk about, before you decide to self-publish or pursue an alternative, what you need to know and consider. We'll talk about hiring help, looking at service contracts, budget, finance, those sorts of concerns. And then towards the tail end of the conversation, we'll get into distribution and marketing concerns. So definitions, I think, are important so we all know what we're talking about. We're using the terms in similar ways because this is sometimes an area of confusion for writers. There's self-publishing, but people talk about self-publishing in different ways. Some call it indie publishing or DIY publishing. There's also hybrid publishing. There are things like assisted publishing, vanity publishing, subsidy publishing. There are all these different terms. I tend to just put them all into roughly the same bucket of self-publishing, where it's the author who's taking the financial risk. But to explore this a little further, I'm looking to Mark to help us here, because there are all these terms, and some of them are like really loaded and negative, I have to say, like vanity publishing. So can you discuss maybe the various flavors of self-publishing from like the more DIY approach, where the author is really becoming a publisher in and of themselves, versus maybe hiring a service to take care of editing, design, production, printing, and so on?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you said, there's so many different flavors, and one of the challenges is there's so many different overlaps between, particularly when you get to hybrid publishing. But the concept of self-publishing, and I want to address, self-published authors have adopted the term indie author or indie publishing out of maybe not even understanding or knowing that there are indie publishers that are independent presses, thousands of them across the United States and maybe hundreds of them in Canada. But they adopted the term to try to get away from the negative connotation. There's still a negative stereotype about that. But at the highest level, you've got on the one end, like you said, the DIY, do it yourself. And then you've got fully assisted, and you've got a whole bunch of options in between. One of the things I like to think about is when doing self-publishing, the only self is self-directed, meaning, yes, you're in charge. You get to decide cover and editorial content and distribution and when it's going to go out in marketing. But all of the really smart authors know that it's important to hire good editors. It's important to hire people who understand book cover design because they're trying to hit a target. So I think one of the challenges is there's so many different flavors, but you think at the DIY where I'm in charge of everything, I've got to hire my editors, I've got to hire my cover designers, and then you make the decisions on how you're going to publish, which kind of comes later. Like, am I going to use this service? Do I want paperbacks? Do I want ebooks? Do I want audiobooks? The other thing that people often ignore or they don't recognize one of the types of self-publishing is community. And that is, we could go to wattpad.com as a perfect example where it's free to consume and it's free to publish. But so is WordPress and Blogger and YouTube and TikTok and Instagram stories and all those things. That is technically self-publishing. So it's a much bigger sphere. Now, folks like Tara and I are very specifically geared towards helping provide tools for authors who want to self-publish. Here are some tools you can use to get onto the retail platforms. And then so many different flavors, so many different companies. What I would advise writers do right up front is, before working with anyone in the industry, writer beware, run by the Science Fiction Writers Association. Victoria Strauss is a goddess in my mind, having managed this website. And the Alliance of Independent Authors also has a really great outline of various players. And I really think it's great for authors before they want to say, hey, what is Draft to Digital like? Should I work with them? Should I do that? Go and check them out on Writer Beware. Go check them out on those sites. I think that's really an important thing that writers need to do up front. Like, bookmark that site immediately. Like, pause this if you're watching the broadcast later. Go bookmark the site.
Thank you so much, Mark. So now I want to turn to Brooke so that you can tell us a bit about hybrid publishing and what makes it different from what Mark is discussing.
Yeah, I mean, hybrid publishing is, like a new old model, basically. It's something that in some ways has been around for forever in legacy publishing, because lots of traditional publishers have cut hybrid deals for a long time. I started She Writes Press almost 10 years ago, and I think the thing that primarily sets us apart from what Mark is talking about, and it's going to vary. I think that's an important caveat, because there are many hybrid publishers, or I should say service providers, who are calling themselves hybrid publishers. And so it's very important that you all understand the difference between what a service provider is and what a hybrid publisher is. And I can put this in the chat, and I think it will be in the notes too, Jane, that the Independent Book Publishers Association put together a hybrid criteria list. And that was done during the time I was on the board of the IBPA. And we felt that that was a really important thing to do, exactly because we wanted to help people understand the difference between a service provider and a hybrid publisher. And we always say it's not that there's anything wrong with a service provider, it's just that they should call themselves service providers. And I think the primary difference with a hybrid publisher is that a hybrid publisher vets manuscripts so that there's some sort of submissions process. Importantly to me is the distribution, which I'm glad we'll get into a little bit later. Understanding distribution, of course, could be a 6-week course or longer. We're hardly going to be able to get into the nitty gritty today, but our presses do have traditional distribution with Ingram Publisher Services. So that means there's a sales force, something that some self-published authors can have access to, but certainly not easy, because you have to prove a certain baseline of sales to be able to get traditional distribution. You need to be doing, or your hybrid publisher ideally should be invested in some form of marketing and publicity, informing you about how the industry works. So how I see a true hybrid working is a publisher, who is invested in the outcome and who is not just taking books and putting them up on Amazon or other online platforms. And again, that's fine, but a publisher really should be advising and seeing you through, and it's more of a process and more of an investment. And it's not, we do not consider it self-publishing, because as Mark said, there's also nothing self about what we're doing, other than we want to collaborate with the authors, of course, and hybrid publishing, in our definition of it, is author subsidized. So in that way, it will never be traditional publishing, and it's not trying to be traditional publishing.
Excellent. Thank you. That's super helpful. I want to turn to the authors now, Leslie and Darian, to talk about how you ended up deciding to self-publish. when you first, entered into that space, how you see it, and if you have advice or insight for others trying to make their own decision. And let's start with Leslie.
I have a background in website development, so I have a lot of technical skills that made me feel more confident about self-publishing and doing certain things myself. I first self-published my novel in 2015. And another thing that went into my decision-making was just what I was writing. I write fantasy, and I had heard lots of horror stories about traditional publishers, especially when it came to authors of color, and either they're not getting published, and at that time, in the mid 2010s, or people were being asked to change characters and change stories. And I just wasn't interested in any of that. And I had already had a background in other DIY pursuits. I had done filmmaking. I had co-founded a literary magazine. So there were a lot of skills in terms of knowing how to create an ebook. But even if I hadn't had those skills, I did a lot of research. I spent about a year all during writing the book and the many, many drafts of the first book, researching self-publishing, listening to podcasts, reading blog posts. And so those kind of factors made me feel confident that I could. I also, was putting away money, so I had a budget. I had joined online groups and talked to other authors, and just to get an idea of what was needed. And so, doing lots of research and feeling comfortable with it. I know a lot of people who didn't have technical skills. That's not a requirement necessarily, but it was something that made me feel like I was making the right choice for me and for my story. And I didn't want to have to compromise any of the artistic vision, but I still wanted to have a really professional product that, I'd be proud to show people. So those are kind of my thought process.
When you say technical skills, could you just briefly expand on what that means for you or for other authors?
Well, especially then, in terms of creating an ebook, we didn't have tools like Vellum or Atticus, or the things that automatically make your Mobi and your EPUB. So for me, it was, it's HTML and Sigil and whatever these other programs that were much less user-friendly than the tools we have today. That was one thing. Creating graphics, I did know Photoshop, and so I was able to create teaser graphics and things like that before, once again, something that allows non-technical or non-designers to create pretty good looking designs, book brushes, another thing. Mm-hmm. And then, that was basically it. I mean, there's not a whole lot else technical. Making my website, which is something that I do in my day job, those kinds of things that I knew I would otherwise have to spend money on. I could save some money by being able to do those things myself. I knew I could not design my own cover. I wasn't that good with Photoshop.
And Darian, I know you have a unique perspective here because you've been with the Big Five, and now you've started your hybrid publishing program. Tell us more about your story here.
Okay, so I kind of came in from a different direction, which is that I was traditionally published to begin with. So I have 5 books out with novels with Penguin Random House. And I did 2 titles after that and decided to self-publish, in part because they were novellas. But I think one thing that helped was the fact that I had a really clear idea of what the process was like. And I really, I think what Leslie has said about having some skills when you come to the table, when you start thinking about self-publishing, helps tremendously, because there is a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done if you decide to go this route. And I had the advantage of sort of understanding what the pathway was, of understanding the importance of a good cover, that it's not just pretty, but where the text appears and the size of the text and all these small things that go into helping readers find your book. I had some of that from having been with traditional publishing. I also at that time for myself was sort of thinking, well, these would be fun. I don't want to wait that long. It's almost 18 months from the time the publisher receives your manuscript and has approved it before it comes out to pub. And there are good reasons for that, right? For sales and marketing and other advanced things they need to do. But I knew I wanted to get these titles out to my readers quickly, and these 2 novella type books that had come out that were related to my traditionally published books. So I did go ahead and release those 2 on my own. And since then, I've worked with indie publishers. I've worked with small houses. So I've had a chance to work in almost, I think, every kind of publishing that's available right now. And I think that's actually what's really exciting for writers now, is seeing that some of those lines of demarcation between indie publishing, self-publishing, and traditional publishing is blurring. I mean, we're seeing it with traditional publishers getting more into that sort of self-pub space. So I think it's an interesting thing to keep an eye on for all writers, but I think you do need to come in with a really clear idea of what's ahead.
So Tara and Mark, and we'll start with Tara, you, I imagine, communicate with hundreds, if not thousands of authors over the course of a year. You see lots of experiences, you know what people's expectations are versus their results. What do you think writers need to know or understand, acknowledge upfront before they get too far into this process?
Sure. I think just wanted to comment on what Darian just said, which I think is a really great point about the how people are moving into a more hybrid model or that the lines are sort of blurring. And like at Kobo, we sort of have that kind of insight to see that's like, oh, you have all these publishers that are really taking advantage of the indie tools that are out there. So it's very exciting to see how it's kind of blurring and where it would go. But I think things to consider first in like kind of when you're going down this route, I think really is that it requires a lot of confidence to be an independent author. You're your own hype person, and you have to sort of be willing to do that at the beginning of everything that you're doing. You know, it really shouldn't put an author off, but like going this sort of indie route, just something to be aware of is that the pressure is on you to do the marketing that the publishers are really kind of taking away from you, not away from you, but off of your plate when you're kind of going with them. And then as we kind of talked about as well a little bit already is the second biggest challenge I really see is the learning curve. So I loved that Leslie was saying that, you know, spending a whole year researching this business, that's really key. It's a lot to learn, especially if you're coming from it completely outside. You know, you really just like writing and that's what you want to do. And all of a sudden you have to be sort of so knowledgeable about the different aspects of the business. So I really think taking the time is sort of key on that to making sure that you're sort of prepared for when you do go there. Yeah, I think that's sort of it.
Do you have anything to add, Mark?
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, I'm an optimist, and I think there's never been a better time to be a writer. And one of the beautiful things about this is writers have more choice than they've ever had in the history of writing and publishing. They have opportunities to license their IP. I like to think of it, I know our books are our babies, but I think of intellectual property, license books to a publisher, work with hybrid publishers, work with professionals in the industry, self-publish, or a combination. I have good friends. Canadian author Robert J. Sawyer sold the rights to Penguin Random House in print only for North America, or actually in Canada, and then in the US went with a smaller publisher, traditional publisher that gets his books in the bookstores, kept all the digital rights. So he had multiple licenses. So there's great opportunities like that. The other thing that frustrates me about the indie publishing community is I am an optimist, but I know that it's not all that different than traditional publishing. You have these brilliant people in New York and Toronto and London and everywhere publishing great books, and they're all wonderful, talented people who know the industry inside and out, but they're still throwing spaghetti at the wall. And apart from the Lee Childs and the J.K. Rowlings and the ones that we know are going to make billions of dollars, they don't really know what's going to sell. But that's the excitement of the industry. It's the 80-20 rule. 20% of the titles are making the profits for these publishers, like 80% of the profits. It's not all that different in self-publishing. So if you're doing your research, like Leslie did, probably found out, yes, it's hard work. It's just as much work, maybe even more so, because at least you don't have that publisher partner to share some of the costs and frustrations with. But I do want authors to recognize it's a lot of work. It's hard. Not everyone's going to be a millionaire, even though you get to keep more of your royalties after those investments. But it is something that grows. One of my favorite sayings comes from a used bookstore, Bay Used Books in Sudbury, Ontario, where I grew up. And there was a stamp on the book that said, "A book you haven't read is a new book." And what I think I love about the digital publishing, and I even had a title published in 2016 that sold way more in the last 9 months than it did in the previous 5 years. It's like an old backlist title that's suddenly starting to sell. So that's the one of the differences between indie publishing and trad publishing is it's not about the first 90 days in a bookstore on co-op display somewhere. It can be a much longer tail of opportunity for writers.
So let's talk a little bit about costs. Obviously, this can vary dramatically from author to author. It depends on whether or not you're working with a hybrid or a service company. or doing things on your own, like using Vellum and Atticus, as Leslie discussed. But still, I want to try and give people a rough estimate of what we're talking about. Maybe we'll start with Brooke here, and you can talk about the sort of costs that might be expected if you work with a hybrid or maybe as a service company.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really varies quite wildly, actually. I currently we have a single publishing package, and we've always only had a single publishing package, which the price has increased, of course, over 10 years quite a lot, as I think we've wrapped our minds around the real costs to publish well. Our current publishing package is $8,500, which is probably middle of the road. You know, there's much cheaper and there's much more expensive out there. I've done quite a lot of cost comparisons. And I think it's obviously super important as an author that you understand what is in that publishing package. What is it inclusive of, and what does it not include? Because, for instance, our authors do pay for their print runs, but we are the print run, they're paying for the manufacturing cost only, which ultimately I think is a smart way to do it, as opposed to some of the service providers and or hybrids who might require a buy-in of, you know, X number of copies. I'm always a little wary of that, you know, a guaranteed buy, for instance, on a print run, which I think in some cases they're selling back to their authors for 50%, whereas we're saying to the author, you're just paying the manufacturing cost. And then, of course, if they sell directly, then they have a chance to make, you know, still the profit margins are small in this business, but it's still something. So, and then there's so many other costs associated with being an author, as any of the authors on the panel will certainly know. I mean, whether it's your website or travel costs, whatever you're doing for publicity and marketing. And so I've always been of the mind to really educate authors about the full extent of what they're getting themselves into, so that they understand the long-term expectations versus ROI on their investment. So I always appreciate that you bring it right to the money, Jane, because I think it's a super important conversation for authors to have, and not to go into that blindly.
Leslie, can you talk about the costs as you experienced them?
Sure. Usually when I think about a novel that I'm going to self-publish, if it's somewhere between 70 to 90,000 words, I will budget $2,500 to $3,000. And that is for the cover design, developmental edits, copy edits, and a proofread. And those are the main costs I budget for. I don't, you know, I possibly think about marketing if I'm going to do like a small, like a cover reveal tour, but those are pretty inexpensive. And there's not a lot of, I mean, you know, people vary as to whether they even work those kind of blog tours anymore. Sometimes it's just nice to do something to feel like you're doing something, because a lot of this is just throwing it on the wall, seeing if it sticks, kind of like the traditional publishers. And there's different ways to approach it, obviously. I know a lot of people who spend a lot of money on advertisement. I don't do a lot of advertising my books because I don't have long series that are self-published. I'm also traditionally published too. So the way that my books are, they don't lend themselves towards advertising. So a lot of the budgeting has to be kind of smart and looking forward, are you writing a series or versus a standalone? You know, the genre that you're in, do they do well on advertising? And when I talk about advertising, usually it's Facebook and Amazon ads. And then to a certain extent, BookBub ads also. But yeah, those are the general costs that I think about. And then obviously it's less if it's a shorter work, if it's a novella or a short story. Yeah.
Darian, do you want to jump in on this question?
You know, I think the thing that some authors who are new to the self-publishing space aren't always prepared for is there is going to be some money that needs to be on the table. You know, that it is really important that again, you do your research, you understand that, you know, it is important, as Mark has said and Leslie said, that you have people looking at your manuscript, another set of eyes, professional eyes, and you have it laid out properly. And you do all these steps in a way that's going to really maximize the reader experience. You know, I feel like a lot of writers are so excited by the romance of writing, which I think is really important, but it is a long game. And I think it's important to sort of understand what some of those components are. And then just decide for yourself, where am I a good fit with these components and where do I need help? And then what's happening with my budget? You can definitely hack it. I hacked it. I prepped all my own Mobi files and did all that, and it does help to have a certain amount of technical skills, because you can pay people to help you, but they make mistakes too. So you being able to oversee that is part of this process. So I think having a budget, it will vary from person to person. Some people, as Leslie said, will do ads. We are seeing that that's something that's effective for certain genres and types of books out there. It's hard to just drop a book on Amazon or whatever platform and then expect it to take off if you don't have a following. So I think understanding that and maybe building towards that is going to help.
So I'd like to pause here for a question that I saw pop up in the Q&A, which, has to do with children's work. So the question from Neil is this conversation as relevant for a children's book author as for, say, an adult novelist? And I think it's a really important question for maybe a couple of reasons. One, if we're talking about children's picture books, those can have different economics associated with them because of the full color printing and the increased unit cost, which results in a higher retail price, which prices you out of the market in some cases. And also because I feel like there's still a really strong gatekeeping role in children's, where librarians and educators and teachers, are recommending books, and they might, if it's a picture book or maybe middle grade, maybe if it's self-published, they're not as, not as open to that. Does anyone want to comment about any of the unique considerations the children's market presents? Mark? Yeah.
Well, one of the things I want to say is, so, Kobo and Draft to Digital are two examples where you can get an ebook converted for free from a Word document. None of the free EPUB conversion tools work well with children's books. So that's kind of like Vellum, yes. And better yet, hiring a professional designer is where you have to go. So the costs are going to, the cost Leslie said, add a couple thousand to that, at least is a strong consideration, I think.
I just want to echo what you said, Jane, because we do some children's books on our Spark Press imprint, not on the She Writes imprint. And what I will say about the sales force is that they are really picky about the children's illustrations. We've gone sometimes and they're just like, this doesn't cut it. You need to go back, get a different illustrator. They want the, what are essentially galleys, like they call F and Gs, these sort of pages that you present, that they get to the reps way, way early. And of course, that's on the side of having a sales force. So when you're in the self-publishing space, I think the children's marketplace is uniquely competitive. And so it's just important to understand that, and that you probably, all that research that Leslie said about the industry, double down on that big time to really understand what the consequences are. Because I think, the most important thing is to have your eyes open going into any endeavor so that you know what the possibilities are. And it might make sense for, for some of you out there listening to consider a hybrid publisher for the sake of the distribution. So it's, there are so many different ways in, and I love what Mark said. It's like never been a better time to be an author. There are so many possibilities and opportunities. But I know a lot of people just kind of walk in a little blindly or perhaps a little naively, and then, learn the hard way, but that's also a good way to learn. So.
Excellent. Thank you. Anyone else on that before I move on?
Just that like format can also be interesting in terms of like independently publishing children's books, because the formatting, like you were saying, has to be so particular in terms of the ebook, and it kind of lends itself more to a physical thing. But what we've seen over the past year is the real increase in audiobooks for kids, because they want to just be able to listen to things, have stories, do things like that. So that might be an additional cost again, but you might have to consider like diversifying your format far quickly than you would if you were just publishing a standard novel.
Terrific. And I did just put in the chat, there's one particular self-publishing author, Darcy Pattison, who's been working at self-publishing her work for many years now, who's been quite successful. She's been very generous with sharing why it works for her and how she does it through her own website and different Q&As. I've hosted a Q&A with her at my site if you go looking for her there. Okay, so let's move on to another topic, which is, let's say a writer wants to self-publish, but their first time out, they would much rather have the feeling of safety and security of working with a company, rather than having to handle it all themselves. I know one of the biggest challenges writers face is finding a company that's reputable, or is going to be transparent in what they can do. There's so much confusion around what these services should cost. And I know we've already discussed that, but still, because of the wide variation, people wonder, if I pay $50,000, am I getting anything that's actually worth $50,000 instead of $10,000? So Brooke, maybe you can try tackling this sticky wicket first, as far as how finding the reputable help and knowing if you're overpaying.
Right. I mean, it's a very important question. And just as we're saying that there have never been so many opportunities, there's also never been so many people trying to take advantage of authors, right? So it's one of the things that I'm very mindful of, because I have a press that charges people. It's something that I've thought about from the very beginning, to be uber transparent in what we're doing, to feel good about the price points and what we're offering and what that is. And I always say to people, the best way forward is to interview the other authors that the press has published. In terms of doing your research, I can sit here and have a phone call with someone about why we're the best press for them, and how we're different from self, and how we're different from traditional. But I always point back to saying that the best ambassadors for what we're doing are our own authors, because they're honest and it's not perfect. There are things that our authors love about the experience, and there are things that our authors don't love about the experience. And I think that's very real, and that's okay. And I want people to go in with, a sense of what's possible, but it's not a slam dunk, and it's not a slam dunk for any author anywhere. And so that's always been important to us in terms of having the community, and that our authors actually speak to one another. I think there's been a long legacy in publishing, especially in traditional publishing, to keep the authors away from each other. No one talked to each other. There's kind of the wizard behind the curtain pulling all the strings, and like, you get $500 for your budget, and another person gets 20 grand, and no one has any transparency into that. And it's a bit of a mystery as to how we succeed as a result. So I love the informational aspect of this kind of panel. It's amazing, and to hear from experts, but I sometimes think the people who can give you the best information are the people on the ground who have done it and gone through it. And they'll of course give you their real impressions of what it was like for them, but interview more than a few. It's the information gathering process, right? So that you get a range of what's happening with the authors. That's my advice.
And if you're presented with a contract, whether it's a service company, a hybrid, I realize some of these contracts might not really be negotiable, but I think sometimes the terms are, there's wiggle room. Is that something you should hire a literary lawyer? You should find an agent?
Ours are definitely negotiable, and the Authors Guild does a ton of our contract negotiations. And I am so grateful, because I think that also gives more legitimacy to the process. If an organization like the Authors Guild will look at our contract and say, it's pretty good and you can negotiate these parts. I think literary lawyers are expensive, and sometimes they over negotiate contracts. And so that's my only downside on them. But if someone wants to do that, that's great. I honestly think Authors Guild is probably one of the best resources for the money. I always say to people, of course, if a publisher will not negotiate a contract, I would see that as a red flag. Not to say they can't have points that are non-negotiable, of course, but to say like nothing is touchable in this contract, I would walk away from that contract.
Great.
I just have to heartily agree with that, Brooke. That is a sign of a real publisher or a real hybrid publisher that's willing to work with authors as opposed to lock them into something. It is a negotiation, and if they're not willing to negotiate, and again, negotiation doesn't mean they're going to change it. With Dundurn, one of Canada's largest independent publishers, I think I requested 12 clause changes. They changed 10 of them. I didn't get 2 of them. I was really ecstatic that they were able to change the other ones, because it's negotiation. And that to me is a really great sign. So I'm glad the Authors Guild helps with that process.
Anyone else before we move on?
just to reiterate how important community is and being able to talk to other authors who've gone through things, like all of the people that I work with, designers and editors, are referrals. And because I've joined various online communities and even in-person communities for genre, but these days online is great. You can ask people, who is your copy editor, who's your developmental editor, and look at someone in a similar genre as you. And then people have a range of costs for their services, so what your budget is, and just having those resources, joining some kind of community is vital.
Yeah, I just want to kind of jump on that as well, that it's my favorite aspect of working in this business is the community. It's like, name me another area where people are genuinely wanting their colleagues to, not even colleagues, but their competition to succeed. Where people are openly telling you like how I did this and how I was successful. I find it really admirable to be able to go to these panels like this and different events where there's just such strong people, just really smart and sharing how they kind of did the best and just wanting other people to succeed. So if there's like different genres and, if there's a community basically for everything that you could imagine. So just ask around and you'll find the people that, have probably already answered the question that you have.
Excellent. So I want to talk about one aspect of hiring help related to marketing and publicity, because even no matter how you publish traditionally or self or something in between, I think we all know that investment there doesn't pay you back one-to-one in sales. Usually there's a longer term benefit to investing in that, especially if it's your first book launch. I'm just wondering how authors can be smart about this, since it can be, a traditional publicist can easily cost $15,000, and that's just out of the range of so many people. What are some ways to, do meaningful marketing and promotion if you've never done it before? And if you're going to hire help and you have a really small budget, what can you do? And maybe I'll start with Darian.
I think it's going to depend largely on the genre. So, I'm published in fiction, commercial women's fiction. I'm also published in nonfiction for cookbooks and also for writing guides. And then also I have a poetry collection with Poetry Society of America. So each of those genres, I've done different things on my own part and in terms of working with the publisher as well. So I think part of it is what everyone's already said about community. One of the best ways to figure out what's working now, because what worked 6 months ago, honestly, may not work now, is to say, I've got this new title coming out. This is what it is. Does anyone have any suggestions or advice for the best way for me to get the word out? If you have a mailing list, that's always one of the most powerful things you can have. And so I'd say that if you are in the process of still writing your book right now and you've got a website, you should really make sure you have an email capture of in some form on your website, so that you can start letting people know that it's coming out, and you ask them to help spread the word. I mean, that's sort of a grassroots, old school way to do it, but it is one of the ways that I think writers forget about, right? They keep thinking, I'll just run an ad and that's how I'll find readers. But sometimes the few people who've already indicated an interest are still your most powerful allies, I think, in helping spread the word. So I think we shouldn't forget about that still yet. But I do think it's important that, you find out what's working right now. And you also notice yourself what's coming across your feed in terms of books in your genre and how you're seeing them present themselves to you.
Tara, if you could comment on new Kobo authors or Kobo authors who are looking for assistance in this area. They can't hire, they're planning to do it themselves. What are some first steps you suggest they take?
Sure. When we have authors publishing on Kobo, they are generally publishing widely to mean that they're not just exclusive on one retailer like Amazon, for instance. So one thing that I would always say is to just make sure that your books are just available in as many places as possible. So yes, they're on Kobo, but are they on all of the other places too? When you're kind of creating your newsletter and different things like that, are you linking into places outside of one retailer or one website? I think that's very important. But we also try to offer like promotional opportunities that aren't always just upfront payments, different spotlighting. It's kind of relationship building. We kind of want to learn about these authors. That's why we take so much time with them to see, you know, tell me about your book and how things are going, and where can we slot into what promotions that we have going. So I think it's very important to, you know, Kobo being one retailer, is to just build that relationship and kind of learn what we have available, but to really put in the effort to do that in the other retailers as well. So yeah, we have kind of lots of promotional opportunities. If it's, you know, we do a lot around like different free pages and stuff that doesn't apply or doesn't need a upfront cost at all, to try and get you in that area and in front of people. And then I know maybe this is a little kind of like tangential, but we also distribute to libraries, and librarians are kind of your best bookseller, and they really are the, you know, they're probably going to buy your book if people come in and ask for it specifically. So actually, like, we have a high percentage of, I think it's about a quarter of our sales are like demand driven for indie authors, meaning that a customer has just gone in and asked for the book. And all you have to do as an author is tell your readers that they can go onto the library if you can afford to kind of download this, you know, and then it's kind of a win-win for all of us, because you as an author are then also getting paid, and you're making those librarians happy, who, you know, they are the ones that rule the world really in for books.
Leslie, I think you might have something to say about libraries.
Yes, I mean, libraries have been extremely supportive of me personally, and I do appreciate them. And yeah, being able to get into libraries as an indie, with ebooks, there's many routes. It is more difficult with print, but I highly advise anyone self-publishing to figure out how to get into libraries in any way that they can. I did also want to say about low-cost publicity and marketing. The author collaborations have been really successful for a lot of authors, whether it's something like a newsletter swap, where, you know, you talk about someone else's book and they talk about your book. You know, things like Instagram circles, or there's some other name for that, where you're just getting together and finding a different way to show your audience to other people and share audiences. Giveaways, group giveaways are another thing that's very common. And these are usually done by genre groups, or even age range, if you're writing YA or adult or women's fiction, whatever that genre is. People, if you don't find a group, people start groups all the time. And so it comes back to community and finding other people who are doing what something similar to what you're doing, what you're writing. And it can be difficult, you know, especially a lot of writers are introverts, but I think that having those connections with other people is so vital, especially if you're trying to do something low cost. You know, that's completely free to just share even what you're reading. I've read this book that's in my genre that I love, and I'm going to tell everybody, even if it's only 5 people in my newsletter, about it. You know, it starts very small and then you build from there.
So we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty of marketing and distribution issues. And before we get into some of the distribution angles on this, I want to talk about formats briefly. There's print, there's ebook, there's audio. Maybe, Mark, do you think an author should be going out day one with ebook and print? And at what point does audio become necessary or desirable?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, because obviously you're investing in the book itself and the editing and the design, and you're going to think primarily of print and ebook first. So ideally, the more affordable print format is typically trade paperback. It's also more accessible for more customers. The ebook is the most accessible in terms of typically the lowest price, etc. When you get into audiobooks or even hardcover and large print editions and all the fancy things, yes, there are tools that make it easier, like Vellum allows you to make a large print format, etc., but you still have to go through the process of having the cover designed, etc. When it comes to audiobooks, you've got to remember that it's still a very expensive proposition. And my very first audiobook that I paid, what it was at $3,500 US for, I haven't yet made my money back on it. I actually haven't made back my money on any of the 4 novels, that full-length novels I've done in audio. I've made a lot of my money back on audiobooks, short audiobooks, short story collections, mini ones, 15,000 words, 20,000 words, because paying $200 an hour for a professional narrator, it's only $200 or it's $250. And a lot of my sales have come from libraries in the cost per checkout model, which I know I'm getting into the nitty gritty, but those lower priced audiobooks were a better investigation for audiobooks in the audiobook market and even building it up. And I know eventually, long term, I'll make my money back on the audiobook sales. But yeah, I think start with the basics. You're going to start with ebook. You're going to start with print. And I think trade paperback is probably the most accessible version. Everything else, I advise authors, put money aside. If you're making enough money from the sales of those products, put money aside to invest so you're not out of pocket and having to pay a big debt on those other products. And I believe the ability to make an audiobook probably in the next 2-3 years is going to drop significantly as technologies enable us to do more and more.
And are you referring maybe to AI narration?
Yeah, I have an AI narrated book that was great. I sell it for 99 cents. It's not that great of a computerized voice, but I know that they're getting better. There's an AI voice of me available as well that I plan on using for one of my audiobooks. But the one I narrate myself with inflection and gestures and all the things I do, that's going to be the full priced version because it took me X amount of hours. But the AI version is going to be the cheaper one because it didn't take much time and energy. It's going to get better, probably for nonfiction before fiction. And I'm not saying that to scare narrators. I know there will always be room for human writers and human narrators, but we've got to embrace and see how we can collaborate with the AI tools that are available to us.
So, distribution. I'd like to turn to Brooke first to talk about the advantages that might exist on print distribution in particular if you're working with a hybrid. And I think there might be some super expensive service companies out there that can be helpful too. Tell us about that and how it's different from, say, print on demand distribution that like through Ingram Spark.
Yeah, I'll try to keep the answer short. I mean, for us personally, because we do so much commercial fiction and memoir, the traditional distribution was a real game changer. I do think it's very genre dependent. And I want to say that because I think a lot of people who are writing genre fiction, for instance, can often have a lot more success in the self-publishing world than perhaps memoirists, because it's so review dependent, and getting into bookstores is so important to certain kinds of authors. And so for us, it was these considerations were a big deal, and so the distribution that we have through Ingram Publisher Services, and there are a handful of distributors like this around the country, but not very many. As I said, it has a sales force, but the actual print mechanism is irrelevant. Like we sometimes do very short runs, print on demand, maybe 100, 300 copies. We also do offset. The point is that we print and all of those books go into a warehouse. And then when customers order, whether through a bookstore or through Amazon, those books are picked out off the shelves of a warehouse rather than printed to order, right? So that is obviously hand in hand with distribution, is that you have to have a warehouse solution. And that is why someone like us would partner with someone like Ingram, and that this is the traditional arm, because Ingram has so many different companies and therefore confuses authors everywhere. But for us, the distribution has been a game changer also because it's allowed for us being traditionally reviewed. It's allowed for us to have our books into traditional marketplaces that were previously not available to us. So for the kind of program that we have, it's been invaluable, but I think it's also important for authors to consider always, whether you're considering a self-publishing or a hybrid solution, who's your existing audience? Do you already have a giant existing audience? You might not need distribution. It might not be so important to you. Lots of speakers, for instance, who sell in the back of the room don't need traditional distribution. Many genre writers don't need traditional distribution. But for the kinds of books that we do, I have found that it has opened up the sales channels quite immensely.
So I'd like to look at possibly the flip side of this, because there are many self-publishing authors in the genre fiction, especially romance, I'm thinking of, will focus all their time and attention on Amazon. They'll enroll in Kindle Unlimited or Kindle Select, which puts their books in Kindle Unlimited, and it's an exclusivity program. So you can't have your book in KU unless you're exclusive on your ebook to Amazon, but it allows you this additional revenue stream of getting page reads. I won't go into the nitty-gritty of it, but there are authors who self-publish who earn more on page reads through Kindle Unlimited than they do on actual sales. Okay. I'll pressure Leslie on this one. I actually don't know if you've been exclusive to Amazon. My guess is probably not, but can you talk us through the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, I have in the past.
Okay.
So yeah, Kindle Unlimited, the pros of it are, it has to do with the algorithm. But basically, Amazon wants you to be exclusive for their own business purposes. So they're going to make it a benefit of you. So there are things like the free days. There's some marketing opportunities that you can get when you are exclusive to them. And also the belief is that they show your books higher in the search engines, things like that. They're promoting you. You're getting seen more by their automatic, computer algorithms because you're exclusive. So not only do you get the benefit of the page reads for people who have subscribed to this program and can read, as many books as they want for that $9.99 a month fee, you're also getting the benefit of this behind the scenes algorithmic boost that can happen. But the cons are you're exclusive to Amazon. So they are not the number one book retailer all over the world. When you're on Kobo, when you're on the other retailers, you're accessing more people. And because my traditionally published books are wide, I want, if someone discovers me through those books, I want my self-published books to be available in the same places if possible. So that's why I have decided not to be in Kindle Unlimited or KDP Select with any of my future books, because I do value having that wider readership. I value libraries, which you cannot be in as an ebook if you're exclusive to Amazon. So there are a number of cons, and it depends on your business goals. And one pro is that if you're just starting out and all of this is extremely overwhelming, you can start small, start on one retailer. Your commitment is 3 months. So it's not an infinite commitment. Test the waters for 3 months and get more comfortable with it, and then start uploading your book on other places. And that's a technique that a lot of people advise for newbies, so that you're not so overwhelmed by everything that you have to do as a self-publisher.
Excellent. Darian, do you have any insights you'd like to share on this question?
Yeah, I think to piggyback off what Leslie said, a lot of this is actually going to be whether or not you have a strategy beyond your one book. So if you're looking, for example, to really establish yourself as the author, one of the pros on being enrolled in that program is you have more eyes on your book faster, and that can help increase reviews and things like that. So when people come to your title, they'll say like, oh, X number of people have read it. It's sort of a vetting thing. And then when you want to, you can phase it out and then have it available in other places. For my cookbooks, which are available on Kindle, I don't have them involved in KU because I also sell them as a PDF on my website, because you can't do that as well. So, a lot of it again is thinking, what is my long-term strategy here? How am I building my brand and my name? And I think kind of having an idea of that, when you go into this, is going to help you make some of these decisions. And I did want to piggyback really quickly, if there's a moment, about unless we're going to cover that again, but about the audio and Audible book things. One thing I did, so I'm traditionally published with audio publishers as well. But when I did come out with those novellas, I did release them under the ACX program under Audible. And I did it because I didn't have a budget other than for the cover art. I did it with the 50-50 split with the narrator, which means the narrator also does all the production and helps you upload it, and you get to vet them. And it's not a perfect system, but it is one way. Again, it felt really important to me because my readers are audio book readers because of fiction, that people were able to access it across multiple platforms and early. And I didn't really want to get into full production. So there's other companies that do similar models to ACX now that are probably a little bit more generous. But again, that was hooked into Amazon, and for all the pros and cons with Amazon, it is one thing to consider if you're just trying to get your work out there in the beginning in sort of a broad way. And I still get those revenues, I still get those royalties from Audible for books that are almost 10 years old. So worth considering, yeah.
If I could just jump on this real quick, just to say as well that like you were mentioning there, even with the audiobooks, how there's now other means for you to do that, that you can kind of have that sort of similar relationship with other retailers and things like that. The book industry, especially like the independent publishing, it's very quick moving, which I love. But like you really kind of want to spend the time creating that base of like getting your readership throughout in multiple places. And also what I see from indies is that they really like to jump on things. They like to experiment and try out new stuff. So you can't really do that when you're exclusive. You can't test out like other subscription programs like Kobo Plus. You can't jump on Radish to do serialized content. it kind of hinders some of your experimentation as an author.
Excellent point. Thank you. So it's time for questions, and I've been browsing through the Q&A, and I think I might start with a question from Krista. She's wondering how you handle foreign rights sales, translations, if you're going it alone. And there was also a pre-submitted question asking if it would be possible to find a literary agent to sell those rights for you. So who has some insight to share?
I should now, for my audiobook, for the book that I'm going to be self-publishing. So I started out completely self-publishing. I did get a traditional deal after about a year, and I did that with a literary attorney. So because I didn't have an agent at the time. And then after that, I got an agent for subsequent work. And so it is possible, if you want to stay indie mostly, to have an agent that just does foreign rights sales and does audiobook sales if you don't have the budget or the desire to do it yourself. There are agents who work with independent authors in that way. And that can be really nice to do. I also know self-publishers who are doing their own translations, and by that, hiring translators either on their own completely or through a service like Tech Time or Babelfish or Babelcube. I forgot the name of it. I have to look that up. But yes, Babelcube, thank you. Yes. And so it is possible to, and they have a similar revenue sharing. So if you don't have the money to pay the translator off the top, you can split the royalties with them. And people have found translators on places like Upwork and also through referrals from other authors. So it is possible to do it yourself, and it's also possible to get an agent to handle those additional rights.
I'll say just because, most hybrid, again, perhaps a qualification of a hybrid is to ask if they handle the rights or not, because I would argue that a reputable hybrid publisher, in their effort to actually be a publisher, should. And so we do, but of course, it's one of the points of negotiation that people often keep their foreign rights. And again, you should be able to keep them. And I totally agree with what Leslie is saying. The thing is that most agents don't want to work with someone who's completely unproven, so usually they're more willing to take you on if you have some books under your belt that you've already sold, because it's a big job to only take on foreign rights, of course, unless you have a bit of an audience already built in. But we do work with agents. A lot of times when an agent has tried to traditionally sell the book and has run into roadblocks for any number of reasons. And so some agents are willing to have these conversations, and of course they're going to want to sell you traditionally because they're going to make money that way. But there's just so many different ways to think about this space. And then I do also recommend for authors who are going the hybrid route to consider whether or not you actually think you can sell your rights. Because for a lot of people, I'll say, if you don't have an agent, you know nothing about this space, you might let us keep them because we actually will try to sell them on your behalf. And that's better than you doing nothing with them.
Terrific. So switching gears, Brian asks if we can discuss the importance of reviews. And I think here it's probably important to clarify the different types of reviews. So there's like pre-publication reviews from outlets like Publishers Weekly, Library Journal. There's also just mainstream media reviews like for consumers like the New York Times and so on. And then there's customer reviews or reader reviews that appear on Amazon and Goodreads. I think Brian seems to be asking about people who sell customer reviews for a few bucks. People promise thousands of reviews for a few dollars. I think I can say for all panelists, we do not want you to buy reviews like that. It's actually against Amazon's terms of service. But let's talk about maybe I'll just open it up to the group who has some insight to share on any of those types of reviews.
Start if that's okay. I mean, like reviews for any product, Yelp reviews, etc. It's social proof. When I worked at Kobo, I remember the big data team did a study that showed two books being equal, similar covers, similar genres, similar price points. One of them had a single 1-star review and the other one had no reviews at all. The single 1-star review was 50% more likely to sell based on the study they did, because someone read it, but they don't like that kind of book. They don't like pineapple on pizza, whatever. it's the same sort of thing. It's like, but at least somebody read it and was passionate enough to leave a review. Good enough for me. Maybe that sounds like a book I would like. So I think that's important. And now those are customer reviews. I think the Kirkus reviews, Publishers Weekly, all of those, Library Journal, those are very specifically more if you're trying to get booksellers, bookstores, librarians. They tend to give more credence to those reviews over customer reviews. Not that they ignore them, because if it has 1,000 5-star reviews from customers, that's probably a sign that people are liking it. That's just a couple thoughts on reviews, at least.
I mean,
I'll
I will
jump in
say that
quickly.
sorry.
No, go ahead,
Mary.
Brooke.
I was going to say that they matter, you know, like librarians and booksellers really do pay attention to reviews, and for all of the people who are thinking about going indie or self-publishing, and you're wondering, like, does a paid Kirkus or paid forward, you know, is that going to get you anything? The answer is yes. You know, I absolutely know from the buyers that I talk to that they pay attention to those kinds of things. You can, of course, use them for bragging rights on your book. But one of the more important hurdles that we overcame as a hybrid publisher was to qualify to get traditional reviews, you know, which again is more important for certain genres than others. And so I do think it's really important. This kind of keeps circling it back and is the same question as the children's book person. You know, understanding the genre that you're publishing into is meaningful across almost every point that we're discussing today.
So related, there was a pre-submitted question about if you go through any alternative publishing process, do you have hope of securing, let's say, a celebrity book club slot, or can you see some, like a New York Times review? And I think this probably goes back to the point you just made, Brooke, like it depends on this, you know, maybe if you have a hybrid, or maybe if you have a name in your genre, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this question, but I guess it boils down to, if you self-publish, should you table some of these more traditional publishing aspirations? Because that's what I connect them to. Maybe I'll start with Leslie.
Yes, I think you do have to think about it differently and what the goals are, because it's extremely unlikely that Reese Witherspoon or Oprah is going to select your self-published book. I'm sure it is possible. Like Andy Weir had a great run, not that he had Oprah, but you know, things that start out self-published and achieve great success and move over. It's extremely, extremely rare. So, you know, when you're thinking about getting your book out there, if that's something that you really want, is your heart's desire is to have that opportunity, it's still rare among traditionally published books, but maybe that's a clue that you should go the traditional route as opposed to going the indie route. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of calculus that goes into figuring out which route you're going to do. And there's, you know, it has to do with your genre and the book and your budget, but also your desires, your goals. Are you thinking that maybe one day you'd like to win some kind of award? It is more likely the bigger awards that you've heard of are for traditional publishers, you know, which is not to say it can't happen. It's just extremely rare. So know what you're getting into and why you're getting into it. A lot of self-publishers, there's people who are just in it for the money, and they think that they can write quickly and they can do the things that will earn them lots and lots of money on Amazon specifically, and they're geared towards that. And there's people who, you know, have stories burning inside of them and want to tell them, and it doesn't matter to them how the story gets into the world, you know, and everything in between. There's lots of different ways. So consider really closely and think about what you want out of your writing career, and what's the best path that will have the best chance of bringing those dreams to life.
And just to kind of add to that as well, that it's not one path and then that's it forever. Like, because you've self-published a book, that doesn't mean that you have to self-publish all of your books, you know. You can, like Brooke was saying, go hybrid. Like, you can still seek out that traditional deal if that is what you want. But it's all about making those goals. Is this a long-standing career? Are there smaller things that you can hit? You know, maybe your dream is to just make the New York Times list. Like, awesome, like try and strive for that. But yeah, it doesn't have to be one specific thing. It's just, it's pretty fluid.
So we have a question from Victoria about the many different readers apps out there. So we've touched on one. I think, Mark, you brought up Wattpad earlier. So there are these reading and writing apps that are, it's what I would call serialized fiction, very mobile driven. Amazon, in fact, launched something in this space, Kindle Vella. And there is there's Inkit's Galatea, which recently got a lot of funding. Radish, I think someone mentioned at some point. So there's, I don't know, there's dozens of them, it feels like at this point. And, you know, they're of varying quality and they have varying contracts. Have any of you tried these, and what do you think their role is for self-published authors currently?
If I can start, one of the benefits of a platform, many of these platforms, is people may be terrified to write a full novel. I know National Novel Writing Month is coming up in November, and the whole idea is, let's see if you can just sit down and dedicate 50,000 words. If you can do it in November, you can do it anytime. But there are people that's an intimidating process. And so sometimes this different style of writing may actually encourage more people to write. And what I love about the plethora of these opportunities is if it encourages people who've always wanted to write to give writing a chance, it may find some audiences for them. And they may be satisfied never getting on the New York Times bestseller list, never making $1 million from their books, but they wrote a book and they published it on Wattpad, and somebody from somewhere else in the world loved it and it was the best story they read. That's a huge win for some authors. And I think that's an amazing win for authors, that, you know, we should all have that kind of luck, is that somebody loved the things that we wrote. And so I'm thrilled by these new opportunities for writers.
I think it's quite genre specific. I think as an author coming into this, you know, we've talked about the different genres and stuff. So if you're, you know, writing a memoir or nonfiction, like, it's probably not going to be suited to like a serialized form. So I think there's that to consider. But I think it's very exciting that there's more and more forms out there. I know Rakuten have one specifically in Japan. It's for serialized manga content, and it's hugely popular. So it's kind of interesting to see how this can you know, be popular in other parts of the world, and kind of trying to see it grow, because it has been so popular kind of in Asia and areas like that.
We have a question from Victor, who asks whether print should always be part of your publishing plan, or if there are instances where selling just an ebook is valid.
I mean, I have an ebook, so I will just say yes for platform building. You know, I think again, like, it's hard to get reviews on print books. It's hard to do any kind of national or even local campaign without any kind of print. So again, it's about expectations, but I think a lot of people do them as loss leaders. A lot of people do them to build their inventory, or to, you know, just have something super cheap that is for sale in addition to everything else that you do. So like, my ebook is how to write a memoir book proposal. I just don't want to have it in print. You know, I give it away all the time. It's for sale, super cheap. So I think there are absolutely instances that it makes sense, but figure out what your expectations are and align accordingly. Yeah.
Just say that usually it's relatively little work with something like software like Vellum or something, or even Draft Digital does automatic conversion to I think the print layout. So it's relatively little work to do, and it's kind of like, why not? If it is relatively little work, that's my only addition.
If I can add to that, Leslie, one of the other benefits of a print book, I read on Kobo, love reading on Kobo. I've got, you know, a book right here. Nobody can see what I'm reading. When I buy a print book, it's also advertising. I can leave it on a coffee table. There's books behind me, all of those things. So one of the other benefits of a print book, and the other print book is I can go, Leslie, oh my God, you're going to love this book. Here, take it, go read it, which is harder to do with digital books. So that there's a huge marketing aspect for having the print book.
I think that kind of on the other side as well, that there is sort of a harder side with the print side of distribution, and, you know, the supply chain issues that are kind of ongoing right now. An ebook will always be there, hopefully. You know, it's much easier. So I think it should definitely be the first thing that you do and the easiest thing to focus on, and then maybe deciding whether or not print is for you. But some authors only publish ebooks, but I think kind of balancing however you would like them to work within your plans is the best way.
So I'll pose one more question and then we'll have a final question to send people off on. Do you think advertising is absolutely necessary for a self-published author? And here I'm thinking primarily of Facebook ads or Amazon ads, but we could certainly add BookBub and discount newsletters in the mix. I think those are probably the three most common areas. I know, Leslie, you sounded like you felt like, yes, they probably are necessary. Maybe we'll start with you and circle around to anyone else who wants to add.
I personally don't think they're necessary. It depends on how you want to spend your time, because when you add in becoming proficient on the ad platforms and making your ads successful, that increases the amount of work and the amount of education that you have to do. It's not trivial. And so, some of us don't mind self-publishing. We enjoy it. Like I love it. I don't love advertising and I don't want to spend my time doing that. So, you understand, set your expectations accordingly. Like, I hear from a lot of authors how great ads can be and how, there's 10 million, 20 million books on the Kindle store, and other bookstores, I'm sure, are creeping up there. It's hard to be found. Discoverability is always your enemy. So, but I wouldn't say that ads are necessary, because just they can be a money hole if you don't know how to do them right. And it takes a lot of time and money and experimentation to do them right. So life is short.
If I can add to what Leslie said, I would say, yeah, ads are a somewhat necessary evil, especially if you're exclusive to Amazon, because it's a pay-to-play platform more than ever before. But what's even more important that I think is absolutely critical is, before you spend a penny or a single minute on any sort of marketing and promotions, is if you can't easily tell me what your target audience is, the comparable titles and authors to what you've written, as beautiful and unique as your book is, it still has to be, this meets that, or something that people can understand based on books they've read, TV shows they've watched, etc. That target audience is critical before you even look at starting to advertise or do any sort of promotion.
An anecdote we had from an author once on the Co-Writing Life podcast was that she paused all her ads for a few months and just tweaked her blurbs, her descriptions, and how she was presenting the book, and she didn't lose any earnings, even with pausing the ads. And I thought that was incredible. And sure, she probably has built this author readership already, but it just goes to show that sometimes there are little things that you can do, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like throwing money at marketing.
That is very hopeful.
Our authors also, of course, do tons and tons of ads on Facebook, BookBub, Amazon. And I do really feel like most of the case studies, that the ones who have really gone for deep dives, are breaking even, but they're selling a lot of books. So that's the trade-off, right? I mean, it's like they're breaking even, but then it feels good to be able to say, well, I sold 5,000 or I sold 10,000. I mean, that matters in certain contexts, right? To be able to say that your book has sold through 5 print runs, or, so even though they're breaking even, there's a place where they're justifying it for the higher volume.
That could be, if you have an agent as well, they can use those numbers to get you foreign deals, translation rights. If you're wanting to move from self-publishing into trad publishing, they'll pay attention to those things. Andy Weirhead, how many million people look at his blog? Hey, let's buy the rights.
All right, so our last question, for the authors on the panel, I'll ask you, what do you think you brought to the self-publishing or hybrid publishing process that you thought was critical to your success or allows you to keep going in a way that's sustainable? And then for those of you who don't want to comment as an author, but more as a publisher or an industry vet, what qualities do you see in successful self-pub authors that are pretty consistent? Who would like to start? Darian.
I think you really, this sounds old and tried and true, but I think you really just have to love what you're doing. And the reason why is because, like I said, it is a long game, and there's so many ups and downs with it. And there are a lot of moving parts, no matter what. Even if you have this huge, massive budget and you think you're just going to outsource all of these small individual parts, it's still a tremendous amount of work. And so, you need to believe in your work, you need to be excited about your work, and you need to be curious. I think one of the most important things for any writer is to stay curious. So even if you feel like you're not great with the, business of writing, you know, you need to be curious about it. And then you need to be willing to say, you know, okay, I can learn this, I can figure this out. I think it's also important too that you do have your own internal strategy or your own internal intentions really clear about this process, and realize that if you're not great in social, that yes, you can have social presence, but maybe you don't put all your time there. You know, maybe you spend time tweaking your SEO and your book descriptions and things like that, or your newsletter. You know, figure out where your strengths are and play to them, because it's a lot to do. And so you know, I would just say, just remember why you're doing this, but, you know, expect that it's going to take a little bit of something from you, especially in the beginning as you're getting started, and just stay the course, you know.
I would say important qualities are both confidence and humility. You have to be able to, just as an author in general, be confident enough about your work that you believe millions of people should be reading this thing that I wrote, and be humble enough to know when you might need to change something up. Maybe the book isn't as good as it can be, it needs another round of edits, or that cover is not as good as it can be. That flexibility to change with more information, and to make a change in your plans or what you're doing, because it is a lot of work. Self-publishing it's not for the faint of heart. I do find it very rewarding, and I intend to continue doing both as much as I'm able to, because there are, you know, I love being able to have that control that I don't have with my traditionally published work. But it can be exhausting. And so, yeah, that confidence and that humility and the flexibility.
If I can throw in, we've heard about passion for writing, but I've always said that 3 Ps of publishing success are patience, practice, and persistence. It is a long-term game. You're going to be in it for long. And the last P would be partnership, because I honestly think there's going to continue to be more opportunities for collaborations between writers, publishers, writers, platforms like retailers like Kobo, writers and other writers, as Leslie talked about with a newsletter. You know, I'm going to share your book if you share my book, because our audiences would like them. Partnerships with hybrid and evolving publishers who are willing to do experimental things. That I believe that collaboration and partnership is going to be one of the things that's going to help you with long-term success.
As a non-writer, I think what I find kind of inspiring to me is when you chat to authors who are also just huge readers, and they're fans, and they'll gush about the latest book that's coming out. So I do think that that's, you know, important to kind of remember why you're in it, and, you know, remember to what you're selling, and just, I'm sure it can, you know, sometimes I go through reading ruts where I'm just like, I don't want to open my Kobo, but just remembering kind of like what you really liked about it, why you got in there, and, you know, what you're doing is such a creative endeavor, and, you know, it's a really special industry.
I would say for our authors, you know, there's this balance between self-promotion and generosity, right? And so the authors who understand how to self-promote and to do that well, but also to be offering things that are meaningful to their audience, who are engaging with their audience. So I certainly go back to the power of community and community building, and engaging people in conversations about the things that you care about, so that you're really asking people to enter into a conversation about what it is you're writing or what your interests are, and not just talking at people all the time. So, I mean, clearly that's about the self-promotion, because I agree with so much of, I mean, every single thing every other person said, especially the long game. I mean, if you really want to be a career author, there has to be a next book in the pipeline. You know, the minute you finish one, you're already thinking about the next one, or maybe it's already starting to be written. And that's a lot of pressure because it's so cyclical. But of course, you know, the more books you publish, the more inventory you have, the more money you make eventually. So, and more readers, of course. So all good things.
Wonderful. Okay, so thank you so much to the panelists for sharing your insights and wisdom and spending time with us today. There will be a follow-up from Authors Guild. You'll receive an email with information about how to access the recording, plus some resources that all of the panelists have prepared for you. And be sure to check out more in this series. There are more business boot camps. You can find them at the Authors Guild website at authorsguild.org/bootcamps. So thank you all again, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.